Sunday, December 7, 1941, 7:40 Hawaiian Standard Time. Mitsuo Fuchida, an Imperial Japanese Navy commander, leads his country's first wave of bombers and fighters toward the United States naval base of Pearl Harbor. He is the tip of the spear, the leading officer in one of the most meticulously planned surprise attacks in history. Peering out across the northern shore of Oahu, he smiles. The Americans are completely unprepared. He fires a blue flare nicknamed Black Dragon into the early morning sky. It's the signal to attack. It was an aerial bombardment that would shape the course of history, an attack that had been many months in the planning. Those meticulous plans were put into action on November 26, 1941, when a Japanese task force known as the Mobile Strike Force, or Kido Butai, set off from Hitokapu Bay on Itorofu Island, situated northeast of Japan. The force was a formidable one. At its heart were 6 colossal aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. Together, they carried a devastating arsenal, more than 400 aircraft, including elite fighters and squadrons of bombers, primed for battle. Shadowing the carriers were battleships, cruisers, and destroyers designed for speed and firepower, ready to protect their payload and unleash destruction. Supporting them, a network of tankers ensured the uninterrupted journey across the Pacific. Beneath the waves, lurking in the depths, a fleet of submarines, including the infamous midget submarines, waiting ready to strike with deadly precision. It wasn't just a fleet, it was a war machine, and one of, if not the most powerful carrier task forces ever assembled. And it was all under the command of Chuichi Nagumo. Nagumo was no rookie. With over 3 decades of naval experience, he had served the Imperial Japanese Navy since 1908. His years of service and seniority propelled him to the rank of Vice Admiral, but not everyone agreed that he was the best man for the job. One of his close friends, Nishizo Sukahara, later claimed that Nagumo was wholly unfitted for a major role in Japan's naval air arm. Even Admiral Isuroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor attack, had reservations. He openly admitted Nagumo wasn't his first choice for the job. While he may not have agreed with the attack, he knew his duty and he understood how important it could be. Pearl Harbor was the beating heart of American naval power in the Pacific, arguably the most critical U.S. stronghold. If Japan could cripple the Pacific Fleet in one decisive blow, it would eliminate its greatest obstacle, clearing the way for imperial expansion across Asia. The country had already been making headway into China and Indochina over the course of the previous decade, but it had much bigger plans in mind. The Japanese hoped to push further and further across Asia, gaining strategic control of crucial resources. However, by the beginning of the 1940s, the country was struggling. Its efforts in China hit a brick wall. The U.S., watching from afar, was becoming increasingly concerned, placing embargoes on key resources that Japan needed. It also froze Japanese assets within the U.S. This put Japan in a difficult situation. It needed to keep on fighting, to keep expanding, but resources were running thin and supplies were dwindling. But the further it pushed into Indochina, the more likely it was to provoke the United States into a war. It was a high-stakes gamble: expand and risk everything, or slow down and lose momentum. There was a lot riding on this attack, a lot of pressure on Nagumo's shoulders. His decisions could make or break Japan's imperial conquest. His orders were clear: lead the strike force on a 3,500-mile trip toward Pearl Harbor and maintain absolute secrecy. The only way this attack would work is if it came as a complete surprise to the American forces. If any of the plans leaked or Nagumo and the strike force were discovered, the entire operation would have to be aborted. And so began a top-secret expedition across the Pacific Ocean, a fleet of gigantic vessels sailing hundreds of miles each day, hoping they wouldn't be spotted. November 27th. As the fleet pushed forward across the Pacific, a final attempt at diplomacy arrived in Tokyo. Emperor Hirohito and Prime Minister Hideki Tojo received what would be their last chance to ease tensions with the U.S. It was called the Hull Note, named after the U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull. But instead of de-escalating the conflict, it only pushed Japan closer to war. The note demanded that Japan withdraw all of its forces from China and Indochina and sign non-aggression pacts. To Prime Minister Tojo, this wasn't a peace offering, it was an ultimatum. All Tojo needed was Hirohito's approval to take the next step. And he got it. The ultimatum was ignored. There would be no agreement, no surrender. And so the prospect of peace or a diplomatic resolution ended there. November 28th. The strike force continues to gain ground, drawing closer and closer to its destination with every passing hour. But there is no contact with the mainland. One stray signal, one intercepted message, and the entire operation could be exposed. And if the strike force transmitted anything, the Americans or their allies could pick it up, decode it, and then uncover the plan before Japan even got close. The fleet had only one option: complete and total radio silence. No messages, no transmissions. The higher-ups who remain behind, like Admiral Yamamoto, can only wait and hope that everything is going to plan and that the ships will remain undetected. Yamamoto is the mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor attack, codenamed Operation Z. It's believed he'd been refining the plan since January 1941, drawing inspiration from two key sources. The first is a novel entitled The Great Pacific War, written by a British author and military expert named Hector Charles Bywater. This book imagines a war between Japan and the US, one that begins with a surprise Japanese assault wiping out the American fleet. Yamamoto's second source of inspiration is an actual real-life battle, the Battle of Taranto, where Britain's Royal Air Force launched a daring aerial attack on the Italian fleet in late 1940. The operation proved that a well-executed airstrike could devastate an enemy harbor. After coming up with the idea, Yamamoto spent months perfecting it. He ordered various officers to study Pearl Harbor, learn as much as they can about it, and suggest possible plans of attack. The likes of Rear Admiral Onishi and Captain Minoru Genda all contributed to the scheme, fine-tuning Yamamoto's early ideas into a clearer, more structured plan of action. Genda was also in charge of much of the training prior to the attack. Most of the training occurred in an area around Kagoshima City on Japan's Kyushu Island. The geography and the layout of the area was the closest that Genda could find to Pearl Harbor, so it was the ideal setting to get pilots and officers like Mitsuo Fuchida ready for the big battle. During the training phase, Fuchida and his fellow pilots would fly over a 5,000-foot-tall mountain peak behind the city and then dive down into the city itself. They had to weave through buildings and towers, skimming as low as 25 feet above the ground. At the last moment, they would race toward the coast barely above the waves before releasing their torpedoes into the breakwater with pinpoint accuracy. The training was rigorous and intense, but Japan's military leaders hoped that it would give their pilots the skills that they would need to pull off the attack. As the fleet continues on, Yamamoto and other officers back in Japan wait with bated breath. As November 29th and 30th pass, the strike force inches closer to its target. But instead of heading straight southeast from Japan, the fleet takes a calculated detour, moving north of Hawaii. This is all part of the plan. North of Hawaii, there's almost nothing. No major land masses, no U.S. military bases, and fewer patrols. That meant less of a chance of detection, fewer American ships to stumble upon, and a clearer path to a devastating surprise attack. It's as if fate itself was on Japan's side. The fleet sails forward undetected. No U.S. warships, no stray civilian boats, no one to raise the alarm. With every passing mile, the pilots and crew grow more confident. Their plan is working. Pearl Harbor is wide open. The attack feels not just possible but inevitable. But there's no time to celebrate. The hardest part is still ahead. December 1st. This is a decisive day in Japan's history and the Second World War as a whole. An imperial conference was held in Japan with many of the country's leading figures, all in the presence of Emperor Hirohito, gathered together to discuss their next steps. During the conference, Prime Minister Tojo makes it official. He declares, "We have been engaged in the China incident for more than 4 years, and now we are going to get involved in a great war." With those words, Japan seals its fate. The decision is made. War is inevitable. The United States, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands are now Japan's enemies. There is no turning back. Tojo justifies the decision bluntly. War isn't just an option, it is the only option. The emperor agrees, but Japan doesn't rush to declare war. Not yet. Doing so now could tip off the Americans and ruin the element of surprise. For the plan to work, they must keep their intentions hidden until the very last moment. However, several key figures must be informed, including Admiral Yamamoto. He is told in no uncertain terms that his Pearl Harbor plan is moving ahead, but secrecy remains absolutely critical. Japan intends to time its declaration of war perfectly, delivering it on the very morning of the attack. If everything goes according to plan, the U.S. will not see it coming until it is too late. December 2nd. Vice Admiral Nagumo receives a message from Tokyo. It's the order to attack, the green light that he and the other assembled forces of the Kido Butai have been anticipating. Nagumo is a seasoned veteran in his mid-50s. Years in the military have taken their toll. He suffers from arthritis, and the weight of command has transformed him over time. Among his colleagues, he's known for his caution. He's not the kind of leader to act on impulse. He studies every detail, fine-tunes every strategy, and avoids unnecessary risks. But now, there is no more time for planning. A massive battle lies ahead of him, and in just a matter of days, Nagumo will lead the most important assault of his career. As the fleet pushes toward its designated assembly point, 230 miles north of Oahu, Nagumo remains on the bridge of the Akagi, rarely leaving his post. Everything rides on this plan. It has to go right for himself For the Navy, for the Emperor. For Japan's future. December 6th, the day before the attack on Pearl Harbor. While the American military members stationed at the base have no idea what's in store for them, the Japanese forces meticulously prepare for battle. They have taken up their strategic location north of the base. Every ship is exactly where it needs to be. On deck, ground crews work tirelessly, checking and rechecking every plane, every weapon. Vice Admiral Nagumo pores over the battle plans again and again. Every detail must be flawless. He knows there is no room for error. The attack must be swift, ruthless, and absolute. Failure is not an option. December 7th, 1 a.m. local time. Not far from the southern shore of Oahu and the mouth of Pearl Harbor itself, Japanese submarines let loose their 5 midget subs. They stealthily weave their way through the waters and toward the narrow entrance channel of the harbor. The midget subs' mission is to attack the ships within the harbor from below the water surface. The larger subs wait further back, ready to fire torpedoes on any U.S. warships that try to make a break to the sea. 6:10 a.m. Just before dawn, the Pearl Harbor Strike Force sits less than 300 miles north of Pearl Harbor, and the first wave of aircraft takes to the skies. There is a great range of emotions among the pilots: anxiety, excitement, and honor to take a leading role in such a crucial part of their country's history and push for greater power and influence. The initial wave consists of more than 200 aircraft in total, a mix of torpedo planes, fighters, and bombers. They take off under the cover of darkness. Mere minutes after the first wave ascends, a second wave, this one with additional dive bombers, follows in their wake. Dawn is just beginning to break, the early morning light illuminating the scene as dozens and dozens of Japanese planes fill the air. Everything has gone Japan's way up to this point, but things are about to take a slightly dramatic turn. Earlier in the night, the cargo ship USS Antares spots one of the midget submarine's periscopes peering out above the water. 6:37 a.m. The American destroyer ship USS Ward fires on the midget sub twice. These are the first American shots to be fired in the Pacific theater, and they could spell disaster for Japan. Fortunately, it takes too long for the U.S. to deliver the news of what had happened to the right people. While they're busy wondering what's going on, the Japanese pilots fly closer and closer. At this point, Japan has not yet officially declared war on the U.S., so there isn't necessarily any reason for them to fear an impending attack. Admiral Yamamoto intends to issue a formal declaration of war 30 minutes before the attack begins. At 7:20 a.m. Hawaii time, on December 7th, Japan would officially notify the U.S., avoiding the dishonor of a surprise assault without warning. But the plan collapses. The message arrives on the right day, but nowhere near on time. The delay isn't tactical, it's bureaucratic. Inside the Japanese embassy in Washington, staff struggle to transcribe and deliver the message. By the time U.S. officials finally receive and translate it, Pearl Harbor is already in flames. 7:40 a.m. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida leads the way as one of the frontline pilots in the first attack wave. He flies a Nakajima B-5N2, a powerful torpedo bomber, and arrives at Oahu's northern shore not far from Kahuku Point. There, he and his fellow first-wave pilots begin with a scouting flight along the northwest coast to scan for signs of activity. The sky is clear, giving Fuchida a good view of the scene. He grabs a pair of binoculars for a closer look and counts off the number of battleships he can see. 1, 2, 3, 8 ships in total. What he can't see, however, are any aircraft carriers. The Japanese commanders had hoped that a couple of carriers would be stationed at Pearl Harbor. Bombing those would deal a huge blow to the American military, but they're nowhere to be seen. Still, there's nothing Fuchida can do about that. He pushes on, barking out the word Tenkai in order for the pilots to assume an attack position. Then, to ensure that the entire force is aware of what to do, Fuchida slides back the canopy of his torpedo bomber and fires a black dragon flare into the sky. 7:49 a.m. Fuchida flies over Waimea Bay, instructing to his radio operator Norinobu Mizuki to send a coded message to the rest of the fleet. The message simply says 222, and it is an order to charge. Fuchida also sets off a second flare at this point, as he's worried that a part of the fleet might have missed the first one. This sparks confusion in the Japanese ranks. The moment 2 flares streak through the sky, Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi, the overall leader of the first wave of dive bombers, makes a split-second decision. Instead of waiting for the designated signal, he pushes his units to attack position early. From his cockpit, Fuchida watches in frustration. This isn't how it was supposed to go. A mistake, a break in formation. But he scans the skies and the unsuspecting harbor below, and his anger fades. The attack is already unstoppable. 7:53 a.m. Fuchida delivers a message that will ring out throughout history forevermore. Tora, Tora, Tora. The message is sent to the aircraft carrier Akagi, where Vice Admiral Nagumo has been waiting for news from the front lines. Admiral Yamamoto is also listening in and overhears the message via a ship's radio back in Japan. Yamamoto and Nagumo breathe a sigh of relief. The message is clear: the Americans have been taken by surprise as intended. They had no idea the attack was imminent, and Japan's forces have a huge advantage. 7:55 a.m. The first wave of the attack begins. It consists of just over 180 aircraft. That includes 49 Nakajima B-5N bombers with armor-piercing bombs. They're the heavy hitters of the wave, the ones with the biggest bombs and the most devastating damage potential. There are 40 more B-5Ns with Type 91 torpedoes following behind, along with over 50 Aichi D-3A dive bombers with general-purpose bombs. These bombs are much smaller than those in the B-5Ns, but can still cause a lot of damage and chaos on the ground. Lastly, the wave also features 43 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, whose job it is to protect the bombers, fend off any American fighter planes, and rain down fire on ground targets. Fuchida leads the bombers towards the harbor. Just as they practiced back home in Japan, the pilots drop down low to launch their torpedoes, while fighters race ahead to deal with any American fighters that might try to counter them. However, thanks to the element of surprise, there isn't any time for American fighters to take off. Fuchida scans the ground below and doesn't see any gun flashes. The first bombs are about to drop without any resistance at all. Wheeler Field is the first target to be bombed. More bombs fall on Hickam and Bellow Field, and Japanese fighters quickly cut down the few American fighters that managed to leave the ground. Waterspouts shoot out from the harbor waves. Japanese fighters make strafing runs across the airfields, firing on anything that moves and hitting many of the stationary aircraft on the ground as well. Meanwhile, the bombers continue to rain down terror and destruction from above on their main targets, the battleships. Fuchida, well aware that Yamamoto and the other admirals are anxious about the attack, orders a message to be sent back to the fleet, relaying the success of the attack. 8:10 a.m. The bombers speed down towards the ships, honing in on their targets, with many focusing on the USS Arizona, a standard-type battleship built back in the 1910s. Not all of the attacks are successful. In fact, Fuchida later recounts that his own aircraft has the timing wrong on its first run, and several other bombers have to take up to 3 attempts before succeeding in hitting their targets. Fuchida's craft is preparing to begin its own second run when he and his crew are distracted by the sound of a gigantic explosion. A booming blast fills their ears, and a huge plume of dark red smoke rises from below, stretching hundreds of feet into the air. It's from the Arizona, which has suffered a critical hit to its powder magazine. For those on the ground, it's a nightmare come to life. But for those in the skies, the sounds of gunfire and explosions are positive signs of their successful surprise attack. 8:17 a.m. It takes some time for the Americans to respond to the attack and mount any kind of defense. But by 8:17 a.m. they manage to claim a small victory, as the USS Helm fires at and sinks one of the Japanese submarines patrolling the harbor's entrance. The American forces also quickly rush to their anti-aircraft guns and attempt to fire on the bombers and fighters. They damage some and even send a few craft spiraling to the ground. Still, the Americans are suffering far worse than the Japanese. The damage is piling up faster than anyone could have imagined. The USS West Virginia is hammered by relentless bomb and torpedo hits, its hull torn apart. It drops straight to the harbor floor. The USS Oklahoma takes hit after hit. Torpedoes rip into its side, one after another. The massive battleship rolls over helpless. The USS Utah goes down too, and then the USS California, the pride of the Pacific Battle Force, takes a direct strike, sending water rushing in. As it begins to sink, its crew has no choice but to abandon ship. The harbor is turning into a graveyard. Almost all of the major vessels in and around the harbor are damaged, and the Japanese pilots soar across the skies, surveying the impact of their extraordinary assault. Then, having dropped their bombs and fired their torpedoes, the planes of the first wave begin to make their way back to the carriers, while the second wave pilots prepare to enter the fray. Fuchida, however, stays behind, flying over the scene of bombarded Pearl Harbor to assess the damage and watch the second wave play out. He remains in that position, watching with pride as the bombs rain down in the name of Japan and the Emperor. Nagumo, meanwhile, is back on the Akagi, anxiously listening for reports from the site of the battle and celebrating every successful hit as he plans the fleet's next moves. 8:54 a.m. The second wave of the assault begins. There are approximately 171 planes making up this part of the assault, including 54 B-5N bombers, 81 A-3A dive bombers, and 36 A-6M fighters. The bombers carry general-purpose bombs rather than the heavy armor-piercing ones used in the first wave, so the explosive potential of this wave is smaller than the last. Because of this, the second wave doesn't do the same level of damage as the first, but it's still devastating in its own right, and the bombers have little trouble hitting their key targets. They deal some serious knockout blows to the U.S. forces on the ground and in the water. They target the USS Nevada, which has already taken a few hits in the first wave and is trying to sail away. 7 or 8 successful bomb strikes hit it, ending any hope of escape. Several bombs also land on the USS Pennsylvania, which bursts into a fiery blaze, while 2 destroyers moored nearby are completely wiped out. The USS Shaw is badly damaged and later suffers a massive explosion, causing the entire vessel to split into 2 pieces. 9:30 a.m. With ships still slipping beneath the waves and explosions echoing across Pearl Harbor, the second wave of Japanese aircraft peels away from the chaos. One by one, they turn north, heading back toward their fleet, miles away beyond the horizon. Far from the destruction, Vice Admiral Nagumo stands on the bridge, deep in thought, planning his next move. In all, 129 Japanese lives have been lost in the battle, with up to 60 aircraft destroyed and 74 damaged. But those losses pale in comparison to those on the U.S. side. In short, it's a resounding victory for Japan, and the surviving pilots and crew members know that they have played their part in a historic encounter. 10 a.m. The first wave has been a huge success. The second wave has also done well, though suffering more losses as the U.S. forces scramble and fight back. At this point, Vice Admiral Nagumo has a massive decision to make, and it's one that will prove fateful not just for the attack on Pearl Harbor, but the entire fate of the world in the years that follow. Should he give the order for a third wave of attacks, or is it time to order a full-scale retreat and take the strike force back to Japan? There are pros and cons on both sides. If he goes ahead with the third wave, it will undoubtedly do even more damage to the U.S. forces and supplies. It could more or less put the entire base out of action. If the bombers are able to successfully destroy the fuel oil reserves and repair facilities, the damaged ships will then be irreparable. However, it's clear that the American defenses were getting stronger and more organized. They have a better chance of fending off a third attack. Nagumo's cautious nature starts to take over. He doesn't like taking risks that don't seem necessary and prefers to make considered, calculated decisions with the men and resources under his command. He fears a third wave will result in many more losses. He also worries that the Americans might do more than just defend themselves. They could possibly launch a full-on counterattack. His fears are compounded by the fact that there were supposed to be several American aircraft carriers in Pearl Harbor at the time of the attack, but they aren't there. He worries they might be somewhere nearby, ready to retreat to the base and attack the Japanese forces. Lastly, Nagumo has to consider that the Kido Butai still have a long journey back to Japan. It needs all the fuel it has. Spending more fuel on another wave of attacks could put the whole fleet's survival and return voyage at risk. Even if a third wave went well, daylight is fading. The planes would still have to fly back and land on the carriers at night, which is much more complicated than landing during the day. So weighing up all the factors, Nagumo makes the call. There will be no third attack. The first 2 waves, in his view, have done enough damage. He has no idea where the American aircraft carriers are, and the risks of prolonging the attack are just too big compared to the possible rewards. According to several accounts, various other officers like Fuchida and Genda urge Nagumo to rethink his decision, but ultimately he is the one in charge. His decision proves pivotal. Years after the attack, historians and military experts have argued that a third wave may very well have changed the entire course of the Second World War. It's possible that had Japan done further fatal damage to the base, it may well have been able to pursue its imperial conquest across Asia. Cheers erupt across the fleet. To many, it feels like a decisive victory, proof that Japan's rise was unstoppable. And as they began the long journey home, spirits were high. The future looked brighter than ever. With Pearl Harbor burning behind them, they believed that they had struck a fatal blow, one that would secure Japan's dominance for years to come. But not everyone was celebrating. Some felt a deep sense of unease. They had struck a mighty blow, but had they awakened something even more dangerous? What kind of response would the Americans unleash? The attack lasted just 1 hour and 15 minutes. There were over 2,400 U.S. military members and civilians killed. 3 ships were completely lost and never returned to service: the Arizona, Oklahoma, and Utah. But the aftermath ultimately proved disastrous for Japan. The very next day following the assault, the U.S. entered World War II, declaring war on Japan as well as Germany and Italy. Japan's imperial ambitions would be crushed as the U.S. and its allies battled to victory in the largest global conflict of all time. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed the course of history, but how might things have played out differently? Do you think Japan's decision to hold back a third wave was a mistake? Or was war with the U.S. inevitable no matter what? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Now go check out What If a Single Modern Aircraft Carrier Traveled to 1941 Pearl Harbor, or click on this video instead.